So we're going to do a reading of Montesquieu, the Baron de Montesquieu. Who was the Baron? We'll look up that here in a second. I'm just going to jump right into it because we got some reading to do, okay? So chapter 6, this is book 11, chapter 6 of the Constitution of England. In every government there are three sorts of power: the legislative power, the executive in respect to things dependent on the law of nations, and the executive in regard to matters that depend on civil law. So that's your legislative, executive, judicial. By the virtue of the first, the prince or magistrate enacts temporary or perpetual laws and amends or abrogates those that have already been enacted. So that's the job of the legislature, to enact temporary or perpetual laws and to amend or abrogate those that have already been enacted. By the second power, he makes peace. This is the executive branch. By the second power, he makes peace or war, sends or receives embassies, establishes the public security, and provides against invasions. By the third power, he punishes criminals or determines the disputes that arise between individuals. The latter we shall call the judiciary power, and the other simply the executive power of the state. The political liberty of the subject is a tranquility of mind arising from the opinion each person has of his safety. In order to have this liberty, it is requisite the government be so constituted as one man need not be afraid of another. That's nice, right? If the government was actually protecting people from individuals and from crimes and criminals, not only does the judiciary go after the criminals, but the executive branch is there to stop, crime too, there to provide for the public safety. So who is the Baron de Montesquieu? The Baron de Montesquieu, this is Charles Louis de Secondat Baron de la Brady et de Montesquieu, generally referred to as simply Montesquieu. He's a French judge, a man of letters, a historian and political philosopher. We'll actually take a look at Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. Montesquieu was one of the great political philosophers of the Enlightenment. So this is the Enlightenment 2.0, is it not, with the internet? We're not going to die of ignorance in the information age. That would be crazy. Insatiably curious and mordantly funny. So he's a funny guy. He constructed a naturalistic account of the various forms of government and of the causes that made them what they were and that advanced or constrained their development. He used this account to explain how governments might be preserved from corruption. He saw despotism in particular as a standing danger for any government not already despotic, and argued that it could best be prevented by a system in which different bodies exercise legislative, executive, and judicial power, and which all those bodies were bound by the rule of law. This theory of the separation of powers had an enormous impact on liberal political theory and on the framers of the Constitution of the United States of America. We'll get back to some of his biography in a second. When the legislative and executive powers are united in the same person or in the same body of magistrates, there can be no liberty, because apprehensions may arise lest the same monarch or senate should enact tyrannical laws to execute them in a tyrannical manner. That makes sense, right? You got one person writing the laws and then the other person executing the laws. But if you had the same person writing the laws and executing the laws, well, hell, that would just be arbitrary and absolute power. And there's some constitutions in America, the state constitutions or Bill of Rights, say that you can't have any absolute or arbitrary power. Again, there is no liberty if the judiciary power be not separated from the legislative and the executive. Were it joined with the legislative, the life and liberty of the subject would be exposed to arbitrary control, for the judge would be then the legislator. Were it joined to the executive power, the judge might behave with violence and oppression. So again, you cannot combine these three branches of government, because there's not going to be any freedom. No freedom for us, we the people, for the individuals. And there would be an end of everything were the same man or the same body, whether of the nobles or of the people, to exercise those three powers, that of enacting laws, that of executing the public resolutions, and of trying the causes of individuals. Most kingdoms in Europe enjoy moderate government because the prince who is invested with the two first powers leaves the third to his subjects. In Turkey, where these three powers are united in the sultan's persons, the subjects groan under the most dreadful oppression. Well, you don't want dreadful oppression. You don't want violence and oppression. You don't want arbitrary control. That's why we got the three branches of government. We have elections, constitutions, a Bill of Rights, federalism, the rule of law, elections, bill. So we have a lot of, ways to prevent tyranny. We didn't want tyranny. So that's what the three branches of government is all about. In the republics of Italy, where these three powers are united, there is less liberty than in our monarchies. Hence, their government is obliged to have recourse to as violent methods for its support as even that of the Turks. Witness the state inquisitors, and the lion's mouth into which every informer may at all hours throw his written accusations. And what a situation must the poor subject be in those republics? The same body of magistrates are possessed as executors of the laws. Of the whole power they have given themselves in quality of legislators, they may plunder the state by their general determinations, and as they have likewise the judiciary power in their hands, every private citizen may be ruined by their particular decisions. The whole power is here united in one body. And though there is no external pump that indicates a despotic sway, yet the people feel the effects of it every moment. Hence it is that many of the princes of Europe, whose aim has been leveled at arbitrary power, have constantly set out with uniting in their own persons all the branches of magistracy and all the great offices of state. The judiciary power ought not to be given to a standing senate. It should be exercised by persons taken from the body of the people at certain times of the year and consistently with a form and manner prescribed by law, in order to erect a tribunal that should last only so long as necessity requires. By this method, the judicial power, so terrible to mankind, not being annexed to any particular state or profession, becomes, as it were, invisible. People have not then the judges continually present to their view. They fear the office, but not the magistrate. So that's interesting, right? Instead of always having a court and judges and prosecutors, you only call up the judicial power during the times that you need them. Only certain times of the year from the body of the people, and then consistently with the law. In accusations of a deep and criminal nature, it is proper the person accused should have the privilege of choosing in some measure his judges in concurrence with the law, or at least he should have a right to accept against so great a number that the remaining part may be deemed his own choice. The other two powers may be given rather to magistrates or permanent bodies, because they are not exercised on any private subject, one being no more than the general will of the state, and the other the execution of that general will. But though the tribunals ought not to be fixed, the judgments ought, and to such a degree as to be ever conformable to the letter of the law. Were they to be the private opinion of the judge, people would then live in society without exactly knowing the nature of their obligations. The judges ought likewise to be of the same rank as the accused, or in other words, his peers, to the end that he may not imagine he has fallen into the hands of persons inclined to treat him with rigor. If the legislature leaves the executive power in possession of a right to imprison those subjects who can give security for their good behavior, there is an end to liberty, unless they are taken up in order to answer without delay to a capital crime, in which case they are really free, being subject only to the power of the law. But should the legislature think itself in danger by some secret conspiracy against the state, or by a correspondence with a foreign enemy, it might authorize the executive power for a short and limited time to imprison suspected persons, who, in that case, would lose their liberty only for a while to preserve it forever. Now, let's see about his life. The Baron de Montesquieu was born January 19th, 1689, at La Brédie, near Bordeaux, to a noble and prosperous family. He was educated at the Oratorian College de Juilly, received a law degree from the University of Bordeaux in 1708, and went to Paris to continue his legal studies. On the death of his father in 1713, he returned to La Brédie to manage the estates he inherited, and in 1715 he married Jeanne de Lartigue, a practicing Protestant with whom he had a son and two daughters. In 1716 he inherited from his uncle the title Baron de la Brédie et de Montesquieu, in the office of President à Mortier in the Parliament of Bordeaux, which was at the time chiefly a judicial and administrative body. For the next 11 years, he presided over the Tournelle, the Parliament's criminal division, in which capacity he heard legal proceedings, supervised prisons, and administered various punishments, including torture. During this time, he was also active in the Academy of Bordeaux, where he kept abreast of scientific developments and gave papers on topics ranging to the causes of echoes to the motives that should lead us to pursue the sciences. Now, he's going to write this book, and it's going to sell a bunch in France. And he says that it's not that he promoted it or that it was, just his, his charisma. But the reason why he thought that the Spirit of the Laws, the book, actually sold so well during France when people used to read back then, but also he thought that the subject was just so interesting. He's sitting there saying, here's the laws of all these different places and all these different worlds, and this is what I think about the laws. What is the spirit of the laws? Is there a spirit? Do laws have a soul? Do the laws have a soul of their own? And since he's an Enlightenment figure, that means he's up there with all those, Locke, Rousseau, and the other guys. What's the Enlightenment figures? The other ones. One great fault there was in most of the ancient republics that the people had a right to active resolutions, such as require some execution, a thing of which they are absolutely incapable. They ought to have no share in the government, but for the choosing of representatives, which is within their reach. For though few can tell the exact degree of men's capacity, yet there are none but are capable of knowing in general whether the person they choose is better qualified than most of his neighbors. Neither ought the representative body to be chosen for the executive part of government, for which it is not so fit, but for the enacting of laws, or to see whether the laws in being are duly executed, a thing suited to their abilities, in which none indeed but themselves can properly perform. In such a state there are always persons distinguished by their birth, riches, or honors, but were they to be confounded with the common people, and to have only the weight of a single vote like the rest, the common liberty would be their slavery, and they would have no interest in supporting it, as most of the popular resolutions would be against them. The share they have, therefore, in the legislature ought to be proportioned to their other advantages in the state, which happens only when they form a body that has a right to check the licentiousness of the people, as the people have a right to oppose any encroachment of theirs. The legislative power is therefore committed to the body of the nobles, and to that which represents the people, each having their assemblies and deliberations apart, each of their separate views and interests. That's the commons and the lords, the representatives and the senate. Of the three powers above mentioned, the judiciary is in some measure next to nothing. There remain therefore only two. And as these have need of a regulating power to moderate them, the part of the legislative body composed of the nobility is extremely proper for this purpose. The body of the nobility ought to be hereditary. In the first place, it is so in its own nature, and in the next, there must be a considerable interest to preserve its privileges. Privileges that in themselves are obnoxious to popular envy, and of course, in a free state are always in danger. But as a hereditary power might be tempted to pursue its own particular interests and forget those of the people, it is proper that where a singular advantage may be gained by corrupting the nobility, as in the laws relating to the supplies, they should have no other share in the legislation than the power of rejecting, and not that of resolving. By the power of resolving, I mean the right of ordaining by their own authority, or of amending what has been ordained by others. By the power of rejecting, I would be understood to mean the right of annulling a resolution taken by another, which was the power of the tribunes at Rome. And though the person possessed of the privilege of rejecting may likewise have the right of approving, yet this approbation passes for no more than a declaration that he intends to make no use of his privilege of rejecting, and is derived from that very privilege. The executive power ought to be in the hands of a monarch, because this branch of government, having need of dispatch, is better administered by one than by many. On the other hand, whatever depends on the legislative power is oftentimes better regulated by many than by a single person. But if there were no monarch, and the executive power should be committed to a certain number of persons selected from the legislative body, there would be an end of liberty. There would be an end then of liberty, by reason the two powers would be united, as the same persons would sometimes possess and would always be able to possess a share in both. There's some counties that have, instead of one person in charge, like a judge, magistrate, and a body of magistrates, instead they have 3 county commissioners. Well, 3 county commissioners is both the legislative and the executive branch that has combined. And according to Montesquieu, therefore, we have no liberty. We have no liberty. Let's see, he's wrote the Persian letters and some other stuff on his return to France in 1731. Troubled by failing eyesight, Montesquieu returned to La Bride and began work on his masterpiece, The Spirit of the Laws. During this time, he also wrote Considerations on the Causes of the Greatness of the Romans and of their Decline, which he published anonymously in 1734. In this book, he tried to work out the application of his views to the particular case of Rome, and in doing so, to discourage the use of Rome as a model for contemporary governments. Parts of Considerations were incorporated into the Spirit of the Laws, which he published in 1748. Like the Persian letters, the Spirit of the Laws was both controversial and immensely successful. 2 years later, he published a defense of the Spirit of the Laws to answer his various critics. Despite this effort, the Roman Catholic Church placed the Spirit of the Laws on the index of forbidden books. So the Catholics didn't want you to read this book. On the index of forbidden books in 1751. In 1755, Montesquieu died of a fever in Paris, leaving behind an unfinished work, an unfinished essay on the taste for the Encyclopedia of Diderot and d'Alembert. Were the legislative body to be a considerable time without meeting, this would likewise put an end to liberty, for of two things one would naturally follow. Either that there would be no longer any legislative resolutions, and then the state would fall into anarchy, or that these resolutions would be taken by the executive power, which would render it absolute. It would be needless for the legislative body to continue always assembled. This would be troublesome to the representatives, and moreover would cut out too much work for the executive power, so as to take off its attention to its office and oblige it to think only of defending its own prerogatives and the right it has to execute. Again, were the legislative body to be always assembled, it might happen to be kept up only by filling the places of the deceased members with new representatives, and in that ease, if the legislative body were once corrupted, the evil would be past all remedy. The legislative body should not meet of itself, for a body is supposed to have no will, but when it is met, and besides, were it not to meet unanimously, it would be impossible to determine which was really the legislative body, the part assembled or the other, and if it had a right to prorogue itself, it might happen never to be prorogued, which would be extremely dangerous in case it should ever attempt to encroach on the executive power. Besides, there are seasons, some more proper than others, for assembling the legislative body. It is fit, therefore, that the executive power should regulate the time of meeting, as well as the duration of those assemblies, according to the circumstances and exigencies of a state known to itself. Were the executive power not to have a right of restraining the encroachments of the legislative body, the latter would become despotic, for as it might arrogate to itself what authority it pleased, it would soon destroy all the other powers. But it is not proper, on the other hand, that the legislative power should have a right to stay the executive, for as the execution has its natural limits, it is useless to confine it, because besides, the executive power is generally employed in momentary operations. The power, therefore, of the Roman tribunes was faulty, as it put a stop not only to the legislation, but likewise to the executive part of government, which was attended with infinite mischief. So there's a lot of smartness to it. There's a lot of genius to it. It would be, easy and simple to have one person just say he's the boss, and then everybody has to just listen to them. But that's tyranny. That's totalitarian, fascist, autocratic tyranny. And so to stop that autocracy, you got three branches of government. You got to have the rule of law. So therefore, you have a nation of laws, not a nation of men, but a nation of laws. And with a nation of laws, people could read the Constitution for themselves, and they know what freedoms that they have, what individual freedoms they have, and then how their government operates and what powers their government has. But if the legislative power in a free state has no right to stay the executive, it has a right not to have the means of examining in what manner its laws have been executed, an advantage which this government has over that of Crete and Sparta, where the Cosmi and the Phori gave no account of their administration. But whatever may be the issue of that examination, the legislative body ought not to have a power of arraigning the person, nor, of course, the conduct of him who is entrusted with the executive power. His person should be sacred, because as it is necessary for the good of the state to prevent the legislative body from rendering themselves arbitrary, the moment he is accused or tried, there is an end of liberty. In this case, the state would be no longer a monarchy, but a kind of republic, though not a free government. But as the person entrusted with the executive power cannot abuse it without bad counselors and such as have the laws as ministers, Though the laws protect them as subjects, these men may be examined and punished in advantage which this government has over that of Genitus, where the law allowed of no such thing as calling the amemonies to an account even after their administration, and therefore the people could never obtain any satisfaction for the injuries done them. Though in general the judiciary power ought not to be united with any part of the legislative, yet this is liable to three exceptions, founded on the particular interest of the party accused. The great are always obnoxious to popular envy, and were they to be judged by the people, they might be in danger from their judges, and would moreover be deprived of the privilege which the meanest subject is possessed of in a free state, of being tried by his peers. The nobility for this reason ought not to be cited before the ordinary courts of judicature, but before that part of the legislature which is composed of their own body. It is possible that the law, which is clear-sighted in one sense and blind in another, might in some cases be too severe, but as we have already observed, the national judges are no more than the mouth that pronounces the words of the law, mere passive beings incapable of moderating either its force or rigor. That part, therefore, of the legislative body, which we have just now observed to be a necessary tribunal, on another occasion also is a necessary tribunal. In this, it belongs to its supreme authority to moderate the law in favor of the law itself by mitigating the sentence. It might also happen that a subject entrusted with the administration of public affairs may infringe the rights of the people and be guilty of crimes which the ordinary magistrates either could not or would not punish, but in general the legislative power cannot try causes, and much less can it try this particular case where it represents the party aggrieved, which is the people. It can only therefore impeach. But before what court shall it bring its impeachment? Must it go and demean itself before the ordinary tribunals, the judiciary, which are its inferiors, and being composed moreover of men who are chosen from the people as well as itself, will naturally be swayed by the authority of so powerful an accuser? No. In order to preserve the dignity of the people and the security of the subject, the legislative part, which represents the people, must bring in its charge before the legislative part, which represents the nobility, who have neither the same interest nor the same passions. That's just like America. In order to impeach, it comes from the House of Representatives, and then it's the Senate who tries the impeachment. Here's an advantage which this government has over most of the ancient republics where this abuse prevailed, that the people were at the same time both judge and accuser. The executive power, pursuant of what has already been said, ought to have a share in the legislature by the power of rejecting, otherwise it would soon be stripped of its prerogative. But soon the legislative power usurp a share of the executive, the latter would be equally undone. If the prince were to have a part in the legislature by the power of resolving, liberty would be lost. But as it is necessary he should have a share in the legislature for the support of his own prerogative, this share must consist in the power of rejecting. The change of government at Rome was owing to this, that neither the Senate, who had one part of the executive power, nor the magistrates, who were entrusted with the other, had the right of rejecting, which was entirely lodged in the people. Here, then, is the fundamental constitution of the government we are treating of. The legislative body, being composed of two parts, they check one another by the mutual privilege of rejecting. They are both restrained by the executive power, as the executive is by the legislative. So they're saying when the Senate rejects the House, then the bill is rejected. And when the House rejects the Senate, then the bill is rejected. They had the power of rejecting. Talks about the Persian letters. Here's some things about the spirit of the laws. Montesquieu's aim in the spirit of the laws is to examine human laws and social institutions. This might seem like an impossible project. Unlike physical laws, which are, according to Montesquieu, instituted and sustained by God, positive laws and social institutions are created by fallible human beings who are subject to ignorance and error and hurried away by 1,000 impetuous passions. One might therefore expect our laws and institutions to be no more comprehensible than any other catalog of human follies, an expectation which the extraordinary diversity of laws adopted by different societies would seem to confirm. These three powers should naturally form a state of repose or inaction, but as there is a necessity for movement in the course of human affairs, they are forced to move, but still in concert. So he's saying the three branches will kind of stop government from actually doing things, but since you have to have a forward progress of government, the natural instincts, the natural way of things is for the three branches to get along and to carry on. As the executive power has no other part in the legislative than the privilege of rejecting, it can have no share in the public debates. It is not even necessary that it should propose, because as it may always disapprove of the resolutions that shall be taken, it may likewise reject the decisions on those proposals which were made against its will. In some ancient commonwealths where public debates were carried on by the people in a body, it was natural for the executive power to propose and debate in conjunction with the people. Otherwise, the resolutions must have been attended with a strange confusion. Were the executive power to determine the raising of public money, otherwise than by giving its consent, liberty would be at an end, because it would become legislative in the most important point of legislation. If the legislative power was to settle the subsidies, not from year to year, but forever, it would run the risk of losing its liberty, because the executive power would be no longer dependent, and when once it was possessed of such a perpetual right, it would be a matter of indifference whether it held it of itself or of another. The same may be said if it should come to a resolution of entrusting not an annual but a perpetual command of the fleets and armies to the executive power to prevent the executive power from being able to oppress. It is requisite that the armies with which it is entrusted should consist of the people and have the same spirit as the people, as was the case at Rome till the time of Marius. To obtain this end, there are only two ways: either that the persons employed in the army should have sufficient property to answer for their conduct to their fellow subjects and be enlisted only for a year, as was customary at Rome, or if there should be a standing army composed chiefly of the most despicable part of the nation, the legislative power should have a right to disband them as soon as it pleased. The soldiers should live in common with the rest of the people, and no separate camp, barracks, or fortress should be suffered. When once an army is established, it ought not to depend immediately on the legislative, but on the executive power. And this, from the very nature of the thing, its business consisting more in action than in deliberation. Again, the president is the commander-in-chief. Nonetheless, Montesquieu believes that this apparent chaos is much more comprehensible than one might think. On his view, the key to understanding different laws and social systems is to recognize that they should be adapted to a variety of different factors and cannot be properly understood unless one considers them in this light. Understanding why we have the laws we do is important in of itself. However, it serves practical purposes. Most importantly, it will discourage misguided attempts at reform. Montesquieu is not a utopian, either by temperament or conviction. He believes that to live under a stable, non-despotic government that leaves its law-abiding citizens more or less free to live their lives is a great good, and that no such government should be lightly tampered with. If we understand our system of government and the ways in which it is adapted to the conditions of our country and its people, we will see that many of its apparently irrational features actually make sense, and that to reform these features would actually weaken it. Thus, for instance, one might think that a monarchical government would be strengthened by weakening the nobility, thereby giving more power to the monarch. On Montesquieu's view, this is false. To weaken those groups or institutions which check a monarch's power is to risk transforming monarchy into despotism, a form of government that is both abhorrent and unstable. It is natural for mankind to set a higher value upon courage than timidity, on activity than prudence, on strength than counsel. Hence, the army will ever despise the Senate and respect their own officers. They will naturally slight the orders sent to them by a body of men whom they look upon as cowards and therefore unworthy to command them, so that as soon as the troops depend entirely on the legislative body, it becomes a military government. And if the contrary has ever happened, it has been owing to some extraordinary circumstances. It is because the army was always kept divided. It is because it was composed of several bodies that depended each on a particular province. It is because the capital towns were strong places defended by their natural situation and not garrisoned with regular troops. Holland, for instance, is still safer than Venice. She might drown or starve the revolted troops, for as they are not quartered in towns capable of furnishing them with necessary subsistence, this subsistence is, of course, precarious. In perusing the admirable treatise of Tacitus on the manners of the Germans, we find it is from that nation the English have borrowed the idea of their political government. This beautiful system was invented first in the woods. As all human beings have an end, the state we are speaking of will lose its liberty, will perish. Have not Rome, Sparta, and Carthage perished? It will perish when the legislative power shall be more corrupt than the executive. It is not my business to examine whether the English actually enjoy this liberty or not, Sufficient it is for my purpose to observe that it is established by their laws, and I inquire no further. Harrington in his Oceana has also inquired into the utmost degree of liberty to which the constitution of a state may be carried, but of him indeed it may be said that for want of knowing the nature of real liberty, he busied himself in pursuit of an imaginary one, and that he built a Chalcedon, though he had a Byzantium before his eyes. So I didn't read the entire chapter, so I read most of it there, and that's one of the most important chapters because it talks about the government's breaking into the three branches. It's important to have three different branches. Yeah, you might have to go to one and then the other, but it makes sense to have a judicial review. It makes sense for one person to write the laws, the other person to enforce the laws. You don't want tyranny. You don't want tyranny. If you don't think that's how government should be divided, how would you suggest for government to be divided? It makes sense to me because people could say that should not murder, and therefore nobody can murder, not the judiciary, executive, nor the legislative. If any one of them did it, they would go to the judiciary. If it was the executive or the legislative, they would try each other. Or the judiciary would do it. The judiciary is judicial review. The judiciary also constitutional review. If they try to pass a law that is not consistent with the Constitution, that was, Marbury v. Madison. The genius of Marbury v. Madison was judicial review. On Montesquieu's view, the virtue required by a functioning democracy is not natural. It requires a constant preference of public to private interest. It limits ambition to the sole desire, to the sole happiness of doing greater services to our country than the rest of our fellow citizens. And it is a self-renunciation which is ever arduous and painful. Montesquieu compares it to monks' love for their order. Their rule debars them from all those things by which the ordinary passions are fed. There remains therefore only this passion for the very rule that torments them. The more it curbs their inclinations, the more force it gives to the only passion left them. To produce this unnatural self-renunciation, the whole power of education is required. A democracy must educate its citizens to identify their interest with the interest of their country, and should have censors to preserve its mores. It should seek to establish frugality by law so as to prevent its citizens from being tempted to advance their own private interests at the expense of the public good. For the same reason, the laws by which property is transferred should aim to preserve an equal distribution of property among citizens. Its territory should be small so that it is easy for citizens to identify with and more difficult for extensive private interest to emerge. So there's a little bit of Montesquieu, the spirit of the laws.